In the brutal winter of 1788, a Parisian worker could spend an entire month's wages just to secure a single loaf of moldy bread. Barely 12 miles away, the royal court at Versailles routinely discarded half-eaten banquets of roasted meats and imported pastries. The starvation of the many paid for the indulgence of a few. Yet, within months, the starving masses in the streets would completely dismantle the absolute monarchy. They took a rigid system of power that had ruled France for 10 centuries, and they erased it. How a disorganized, desperate underclass broke a supposedly untouchable empire remains one of the most compelling mysteries in history. To understand how the collapse happened, we have to look at how French society was engineered. The population was divided into 3 distinct legal classes, or estates. The first and second estates, the clergy and the nobility, held almost all the nation's wealth, but were legally exempt from paying taxes. That meant the remaining 98% of the population, the third estate of commoners and peasants, was forced to carry the entire financial weight of the French Empire. That immense burden became fatal when 2 disasters collided. First, France bankrupted its national treasury by funding foreign wars, including the American Revolution. Second, a catastrophic hailstorm wiped out the nation's wheat crops. When the grain supply vanished, the price of survival skyrocketed past what any laborer could afford. The wealth flowing up to the nobility stopped, and the bottom of the structure began to give way. While their stomachs were empty, the streets of Paris were flooded with new ideas. Coffeehouses and pamphlets circulated the philosophies of the Enlightenment, arguments that men like Voltaire and Rousseau were making about liberty and equality. The poorest citizens began to discuss a radical concept that suffering wasn't a divine punishment to be passively endured, but a human injustice that could be corrected. The collision of systemic hunger and the newfound conviction in human dignity made a violent break with the past all but inevitable. By July of 1789, the desperation in Paris had boiled over. What started as frantic riots over the price of flour rapidly organized into a lethal militia. Citizens began raiding local armories, seizing tens of thousands of muskets, but they lacked the gunpowder to fire them. They knew exactly where to find it. The Bastille was a towering medieval fortress in the center of Paris. For generations, French kings had used it as a state prison, tossing dissidents into its dungeons without a trial. It stood as a physical reminder that the king held absolute authority over their lives. On the morning of July 14th, a massive crowd surrounded the stone walls. Negotiations between the fortress governor and the mob dragged on for hours. Tension mounted until a cannon was fired. In the chaos that followed, the panicked garrison unleashed a volley of musket fire into the crowd. The mob surged forward, hacking through the drawbridge chains, swarming the courtyard, and overwhelming the defenders in a bloody, close-quarters assault. The physical capture of gunpowder was secondary to the psychological victory. The citizens of Paris looked at the smoke clearing over the conquered fortress and realized their collective weight could break the king's military. The absolute authority of the crown had fractured. Bringing down a medieval prison proved that the old world could bleed. But dismantling a stone fortress is entirely different from dismantling a monarchy. The true test lay ahead. What would happen when this newly armed, deeply bitter underclass turned its sights on the king himself? The smoke from the Bastille signaled a nationwide rupture. Across the French countryside, peasants began burning the legal documents that tied them to their feudal lords. The focus of the rebellion shifted. The cry for bread was joined by a broader demand for a written constitution that would strip the monarchy of its absolute power. King Louis XVI appeared to accept these new terms publicly, but privately, he made a fatal calculation. In the dead of night in June 1791, the king disguised himself as a common servant. Along with his family, he slipped out of his Parisian palace and rode toward the eastern border, attempting to flee his own country and rally foreign armies to crush the revolution. He was recognized in a small town just miles from the border and dragged back to Paris in silence. That single failed escape erased any remaining loyalty the public held. Louis was no longer viewed as a protective father of the nation.
He had exposed himself as a traitor, willing to wage war against his own people. The punishment for treason was absolute. On a cold morning in January 1793, King Louis XVI was driven through the streets of Paris to a public square.
He was strapped to a newly invented machine designed for efficient executions. When the heavy blade of the guillotine fell and his head was held up to the cheering crowd, an unbroken 1,000-year lineage of absolute monarchs was instantly extinguished. 9 months later, Queen Marie Antoinette would meet the exact same fate. The cheering soon faded into a chilling realization. Executing the king had decapitated the old system, but the revolutionaries had no unified plan for what to build in its place. Factions immediately turned on one another, fighting for control over a fractured, fearful nation. Removing the monarchy did not usher in an era of enlightened peace. It stripped away the final guardrails of the state. Without a clear authority, France plunged into a terrifying freefall where the rules of survival changed daily. Out of that lawless vacuum stepped Maximilien Robespierre. A brilliant, fiercely uncompromising lawyer, Robespierre took control of a new executive body, the Committee of Public Safety. His goal was to stabilize the Republic, but his method required absolute, terrifying obedience. The threat moved from the palace to the street corner. The committee viewed anyone, a neighbor, a friend, or a fellow citizen, as a potential traitor to the state. The Republic demanded total ideological purity, which meant the primary danger was no longer the aristocracy, but the suspicion that those closest to you were plotting against the revolution. This chart shows the daily execution rate as the terror accelerated. The data reveals a mechanical shift in the violence. As the line skyrockets, the executions of the old nobility are quickly dwarfed by the sheer volume of deaths among the common people. The process was heavily bureaucratized, funneling thousands of ordinary citizens, many of them the very laborers the revolution was meant to save, straight to the guillotine. Daily life became a suffocating exercise in survival. Expressing brief pity for a victim, using old aristocratic terms of address, or even showing a lack of enthusiasm for the committee were death sentences. Spies listened in taverns. Neighbors settled personal grudges by denouncing each other to the tribunals. The paranoia escalated until no one was safe, not even the architects of the terror themselves. Robespierre began executing his own political allies. Realizing they would be next, the remaining politicians turned on Robespierre. He was arrested, quickly tried, and sent to the very guillotine he had fed for over a year. The intense pursuit of absolute liberty had forged a surveillance state far deadlier than the monarchy it replaced. The people had traded the oppression of a king for the constant, paralyzing fear of the executioner. When Robespierre's head fell into the basket, the fever of the terror finally broke. The bloodshed had left France in a state of deep exhaustion. Radical political ideals gave way to a desperate, widespread desire for stability and order. That desperation provided an opening. A young, fiercely ambitious artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte watched the political chaos unfold. Armed with immense military success and a genius for public relations, he positioned himself as the strongman France needed to restore stability. In 1799, Napoleon seized control of the government. 5 years later, the same nation that had waded through rivers of blood to abolish the monarchy gathered in Notre Dame Cathedral to willingly crown Napoleon as emperor. It is tempting to look at that coronation and conclude the revolution failed. A decade of violence ended with the crowning of another absolute ruler, but that conclusion ignores the permanent damage the revolution inflicted on the old world. Before 1789, monarchs across the globe ruled by divine right. The French Revolution shattered that illusion. It proved that a king's power was derived entirely from the compliance of his subjects. The chaotic, blood-soaked years of the Republic served as a brutal laboratory. The documents they drafted, like the Declaration of the Rights of Man, established the principles of equality before the law and human rights that form the foundation of nearly every modern free society. The terror was horrific, but the core achievement endured.
The French Revolution demonstrated that the ancient, supposedly permanent rules governing human society could be rewritten by the collective will of ordinary people. We know how the story ends from the safety of history, but imagine yourself in Paris during that freezing winter of 1788. Knowing the liberty that could be won and the rivers of blood it would cost, would you have joined the march to the Bastille, or would you have stayed loyal to the king?